Hello everyone, Professor Krizluk here. So I just wanted to make a video kind of comparing neoliberal economic theory, the ideas of neoliberalism with Keynesian economic thought. So two quite different ways of thinking about the role of the state in the economy, how much the state should have a role in the economy, if at all. So it's an interesting discussion to have. It's an interesting thing to talk about because we're seeing, although we might not hear these terms in the news right now, we hear a debate within the US, for instance, about how much money should the government spend on the social safety net, or how much money should the government spend on social programs. So we hear these debates about government intervention into the market, about the size of the government. Might not use John Maynard Keynes or Adam Smith or neoliberalism, but the discussions, the debates are certainly rooted in these ideas. So I thought it was worth spending a few minutes talking about. So when we think about neoliberalism, it's really rooted in the ideas of like Adam Smith, these classical liberal thinkers about what the role of the state should be in the economy. So we've probably all heard about this idea of the invisible hand, that markets can figure prices out, and then prices, supply and demand, let the market just dictate personal decisions, production decisions, the sale of goods. The market itself is going to dictate these things. So much more rooted in individuals, market discipline, entrepreneurship, and rooted in that is this idea of a small government, minimal government intervention into the market, maybe minimal regulation, really a hands-off, laissez-faire approach. Rooted in, built into neoliberalism is also globalization, international trade, this free flow of goods, of capital around the world in the search for returns and for profits. We hear a lot of these ideas being discussed right now, especially in the United States, where we have more of a free market administration right now. Broadly speaking, of course, there are always outliers, but broadly speaking, this idea of letting the market dictate, deregulation, lower taxes. With globalization, with international trade, that's a little bit more complicated. We know the Trump administration has been putting tariffs, has been engaging in some trade wars. So that aspect of neoliberalism maybe not showing up as much with this current administration. But let's compare this to Keynesian economics. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, this idea of Keynesian economics really emerged during the Great Depression in response to the failure, the perceived failure of laissez-faire capitalism, that markets were not starting again, markets were not kickstarting the economy. We know during the Great Depression, we've all seen pictures of Hoover towns, mass unemployment, people moving, searching for jobs. So Keynes argued that there should actually be a role for the state. Keynes argued that markets were prone to unemployment, were prone to underemployment, were prone to destabilization. So Keynes argued that, excuse me, that there should actually be a role for the state. So when we think about why Keynes was making these arguments, he saw unemployment, he saw a stagnant economy, and argued that, hey, through government spending, through getting money in the economy, we can kickstart the economy. We can help alleviate some of that unemployment. And so Keynes's ideas really became mainstream following the Second World War. In the 70s and the 80s, they're under Margaret Thatcher in the UK, under Ronald Reagan in the US, there started to be more neoliberal policy thinking, more neoliberal economic thinking re-emerging in the US. And then today, it's kind of a mix. When we think about the government today, we know there is a lot of government intervention into the market and free market systems like the US. Under the Trump administration, we see maybe a push for more, again, broadly speaking, a push for more deregulation, for more hands-off approach, more of this neoliberal perspective. So then let's just take a minute to think about the role of the government. In neoliberalism, pretty limited role of the government. Again, broadly speaking, there's always outliers. There's always places where, hey, this free market government system, regime government had engagement in the market. So this is very broadly speaking. But government's role should be limited to, in neoliberalism, protecting property rights. And we can understand why. So you need property rights. An economist would argue that you need property rights so a business, a company, an individual feels safe investing into the market because their investment will be protected, their investment will be safe. Someone's not going to come take their investment. And we saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union that where property rights were quite weak in Russia, in the early 90s, capitalism struggled to flourish, and it kind of turned into a bit of a broadly speaking, a bit of a mafia state because governments weren't strong enough to protect property rights, which meant that big businesses would have their own private army and have their own private security forces. So neoliberals, those that argue, even for, of course, Keynesian economics, say you still need property rights, but at the heart of neoliberalism is this idea of protecting property rights is really the only role of the state, and of course enforcing contracts. You still have to enforce contracts for a system to work. And at times ensuring competition. So if there are monopolies, if there's too much of a concentration of power of an industry, maybe the government steps in to break up a monopoly. Another hallmark of neoliberalism is for advocating of privatization of public services, market-based solutions to social programs. So not a lot of government control of the commanding heights. Not a lot of government control of big enterprises. Instead, if maybe the state owned steel facilities own some of the commanding heights, that they should be privatized. Neoliberalism argued that the markets, free people trading, selling their goods is a better way to allocate resources than the government arguing that this needs to be made. We hear this debate today. We hear it a bit more when it comes around national security issues, though. So in the U.S., we don't really think of the U.S. government owning the steel mill in a city. But we do hear discussions about, okay, are we concerned about industrializing because it might be a national security issue if steel products, if mills aren't open in the U.S. So we hear that discussion. In the developing world, in countries that are still industrializing, we hear this debate a little bit more about the state actually owning the commanding heights, owning the steel mills, owning big property like that. Neoliberals say the state shouldn't control those industries. Again, many Keynesian economics agree, but at the hallmark of neoliberalism is this idea that the state should be out of the market. And when we think about why neoliberals make this argument, they argue that government intervention distorts incentives and oftentimes leads to inefficiency, corruption, and rent seeking. So maybe we can think about corruption in a developing state that has slow economic growth. The government owns a lot of the commanding heights, owns a lot of the production. To play ball, to get involved in that industry, maybe you have to pay bribes, or maybe government officials siphon off resources, siphon off money. So when we think about how Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia, how Vladimir Putin grew his wealth, it is oftentimes alleged that it was through corruption when he was in St. Petersburg as a bureaucrat. So neoliberals say that, hey, you're just opening the door for corruption if you have a lot of state intervention into the market, if you have a lot of state actors in the market. Keynesian economists, Keynesian policymakers, of course, believe in some of the same things. Strong belief in free markets, private property rights. However, there are some differences. John Maynard Keynes argued that government actually has a role in the economy. It must actively manage the economy, particularly during periods of recession or high inflation. So, like our example of the Great Depression in the US, to get the economy going, there should be some government spending. There should be some government intervention to really kickstart the economy. Or during periods of high inflation, the government should, through monetary and fiscal policy, try to control inflation. So this might at times be government spending. It might at times be tax cuts. Trying to control unemployment, trying to control inflation. Another place that Keynesian economists and policymakers really continue to think about this government intervention is when it comes to social safety nets, public investments as tools for maintaining social stability, long-term growth, trying to alleviate suffering from citizens. Keynesian economists argue that there is actually a role for the state here. Again, not this laissez-faire approach of classical liberalism or neoliberalism, but instead that there actually should be a role for the state to help people when they need it. So very different ideas about how much intervention the government should have in markets. Neoliberals, on the other hand, are arguing that no, you shouldn't have this intervention in the markets. Public spending can actually be a burden on the private sector, can actually lead to inefficiencies, again, corruption, rent seeking. So neoliberals argue that no, the government should take much more of a hands-off approach. We hear this debate right now in the US. We hear this debate in democracies around the world about government spending, about what that role of the government in the market is. So neoliberals advocate for shrinking the welfare state, cutting entitlement programs, and encouraging more maybe self-reliance. So if you're following the debate over the budget bill in the US, these are things you hear about more self-reliance, less reliance on the state, cutting entitlement, cutting government programs. We hear a big discussion in the US about healthcare, about unemployment benefits, Medicare. So this is what these debates are rooted in, this idea of what is the role of the state, of the government in an economy. And neoliberals are saying it should be left out, that people should, if they are able to, be self-reliant, that they should be self-reliant. Keynesian, again, takes a little different, that argues that there should be investments in infrastructure, education, healthcare, that intervention into the market to help alleviate human suffering, to help alleviate unemployment. More of a way to step in and help those that need it. So this was just a bit of an introduction to the role of the government into the state, comparing neoliberalism and Keynesian economics. So when we think of neoliberalism, as we said earlier, it really came into prominence in the US under Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and in the UK under Margaret Thatcher. In the UK, Thatcher really began to privatize things like the mines, really began to privatize industries. In the US, although Reagan was and continues to be quite popular for his implementation of more neoliberal policies, in the UK, Thatcher was able to make a more immediate and more drastic, many would argue, changes because of the parliamentary system in the UK, whereas the presidential system does make it a little harder for the executive to bring about big, broad-reaching changes like that. But regardless, in the UK and in the US in the 80s, neoliberal policies really came to guide government policies. And we still see policies like from the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO utilizing these really free market, minimal government intervention into the market policies. So this has created some pushback, especially, as I said earlier, when it comes to free trade. We know around the world, in the US and Europe, around the world, that there is this pushback against free trade that is rooted in neoliberalism. So we see parts of neoliberalism that are quite prominent today, the rolling back of the government intervention in the market. We see this massively in Argentina over the past several years. A whole new way of looking at government engagement into the market. Here in the US, again, with the rise of Donald Trump, but globalization and the interconnectedness of the world, which is a hallmark of neoliberalism, of these neoliberal institutions, we are seeing pull back some, and we see that people are kind of frustrated with some of these policies. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next several years in democracies, politically, how you have pieces of neoliberalism and then other pieces that are really being pushed back against. So Keynesian economic thought, again, certainly not dead today, even if we hear a lot about neoliberalism. Keynes really dominated the post-World War II era, created the Bretton Woods system, an expanse of welfare states. Of course, as in the 70s and the 80s, with the emergence of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, lost some influence, but it really reappeared following the 2008 global financial crisis and then the COVID-19 pandemic, where we started to see more government intervention in markets. We saw stimulus spending, stimulus checks. We saw governments engaging, trying to get the economy started. Okay, so thank you for watching. This was just really a brief introduction, painting with a pretty broad brush, an introduction to neoliberalism versus Keynesian economic thought. Okay, thank you for watching.